Hello. After considering utilitarian ethics last week, specifically in the formulation of John Stuart Mill, with this week we will turn to the subject of Kantian ethics, which is a species of deontological ethics. I'll explain what that term means in a moment, and part of how I will do that explanation is by comparing it and contrasting it with utilitarian ethics that we've already studied. So again, both of these theories of ethics are ways of attempting to conceptualize or articulate what makes a right act, or what makes a right act right, what makes something the moral thing to do. And as we noted, from the utilitarian perspective, an act is moral insofar as it serves to contribute towards an increase in net happiness, so overall happiness amongst all of the relevant stakeholders. The theory that we will study now, this deontological ethics, as formulated by Immanuel Kant, in some ways it couldn't be more different than the theory that we just covered. And so just for that reason, it's very helpful to have them in sort of side-by-side contrast. And so with this lecture, while the fundamental purpose of this lecture is to illuminate deontological ethics, part of the means to do that will be by contrasting it with utilitarian ethics. Again, it's because in that contrast, it serves to bring to light essential features of both of these theories. And so if we recall from last week's lecture and discussion and reading, from the utilitarian perspective, when we think about moral action, we're thinking about we're considering action in terms of its outcomes or its consequences or its ends, right? And so in some way we are attempting to measure the outcome of a given action, right? And then we're attempting to calculate whether that outcome has served to increase net happiness or has diminished from net happiness. And on that basis, we will make our moral judgment. If from the perspective of deontological ethics, it's almost exactly the inverse of that. In fact, while utilitarianism, it sort of discounts the motive or the intent that animates the action, that inspires the action. We're supposed to discount that and only consider its consequences. From the deontological perspective, almost the inverse is the case. And what I mean by that is the measure of a moral action from a deontological perspective is precisely the motive that inspires that action. And Kant will explain that in some ways everything is in some ways contingent and ultimately unknown. The only thing that we can be certain of is our own will, and so our own motive. And so he says the goodwill, if an action is performed out of goodwill, we can't really know the consequences of that action, but we can know for certain the intent behind it, precisely because it was our intent. Again, this is almost exactly the inverse of utilitarianism, because just from that side, we don't really know, we're sort of discounting that inner aspect of the deed, and we're only considering its outcomes, right, its consequences. So again, these are almost polar opposite pictures, and they, I guess, before I continue to list some of the contrasts between these two systems of ethics, I will say one essential similarity, that it's kind of an essential quest that they're both seeking to fulfill. That is both John Stuart Mill in England in the 19th century and Immanuel Kant in Germany in the late 18th and early 19th century. They're both seeking to ground ethics in something in principles of objective principles that in some ways are sort of universally agreed upon. They're trying to escape the kind of the fragmentation or the basic sources of conflict between various religious groups, for example. They're seeking something that is kind of overarching, or in some way an objective, or for Kant specifically, a transcendent ground for ethics. Now, the way in which they go about that, so that in some way that's where the similarity ends, because the way in which they go about that is quite divergent. For example, we might compare John Stuart Mill's approach to ethics as a kind of the approach of an economist. What I mean by that is he's attempting to sort of amass data and statistics in some way, and so it's like, measure certain facts and then try to draw generalizations from those facts, and so you get likely outcomes. You can sort of have more or less probability that some consequence will follow. That is, again, it's kind of I'm comparing it to the way an economist could based on data that's already given, could then extrapolate from that data and try to predict the future. Now, also in the case of economists, we know that that's only possible with a certain level of accuracy, and often it leaves something to be desired. Precisely because there is so much extrapolation that's inherent in that kind of process. You're always basing something in the future, an expectation, you're always basing it on data from the past. Kant approaches ethics almost like a logician. What I mean by that is, for him it's a question of consistency with principles, and they are specifically, and this is the really extraordinary thing about Kant's project, they are specifically the principles of logic. And so fundamentally, his theory of ethics is based on, in some way, nothing else other than the principle of non-contradiction. And that's often considered a sort of essential tenet of logic. And the idea is like, something can't both be the case and also not be the case at the same time in the same way. And so I'll pick up on that idea a little bit later in this lecture and try to express how that shows up in the context of moral action. But so for Kant, it's never a question of the question of trying to extrapolate and make generalized predictions about the outcome of a given action. That's totally irrelevant for Kant, because again, the basis for Kant of moral action is precisely the intent or the motive or the will behind that action. And again, Kant's idea is that morality is the same thing as kind of accordance with reason. And so again, I'll try to explain a little bit more of that in a few minutes. First, though, I will say a little bit about just returning to utilitarian ethics now. We can see why Kant's approach, in some ways it seems somewhat extreme, and I think it will become increasingly clear why it seems extreme the more that I explain it. But in some ways, you can also see why it might be a welcome shift, shifting from a consequentialist ethic to a duty-based ethic, or an act-based ethic, or a deontological ethic. So there's a contrast between ethics that are based on the consequences, they're teleologically oriented, they're focused on the ends of something. This was utilitarianism as an example of that kind of ethic. There's a contrast between that kind and between deontological ethics or act-based ethics. ethics that are centered on the action and not the facts or the outcome of that action. You can see why that actually might be kind of a welcomed shift. And I guess one important reason that it might be a welcome shift is that we realize as long as we are basing present action on future outcomes, if that's the way that our theory conceptualizes rightness and wrongness, any action, it will always be totally underdetermined, in the sense that we never know at the time of the action. You never know what the outcome is of that action. You can never know with certainty. So it's basically setting the basis for present action, which action when we're performing action as moral agents. It's always now. It's always the present. We're never acting in the future. All action takes place in presence. And if we, from the utilitarian perspective, it's kind of a contradiction in a sense, because it establishes the basis for our present action in a future that's unknown. Right? Because we don't know what facts will come of our acts at the time that we actually have to perform those acts. And so in some way it's like you can kind of rationalize absolutely anything, any action, precisely because the outcome is always a little bit underdetermined, and sometimes substantially so. Again, an approach like Kant takes, it totally resolves that problem. Whether it creates other problems, it's something that remains to be seen, and I think the answer is probably that it does, but that's something that we can explore through this lecture and then continue in the discussion. And so for Kant, again, we are, well, Kant's approach, again, it's so different than John Stuart Mill, for example. Kant has a famous quote that goes something like, two things fill the soul with ever increasing astonishment and admiration. And those two things are the starry heavens above me, and the moral law within me. And so Kant has some sense that when we're talking about ethics, when we're talking about morals, it's not as though we're just making something up. It's rather we are discovering something that is kind of operates in accordance with the same, with just as much order and logic as do the laws of physics, for example. And so again, Kant is he's comparing the orbits of the planets and the movement of stars through the sky, that kind of almost mathematical, geometric rigor. He's comparing our moral sense and moral tenets to those laws of nature. And this is clearly, well, I think it's safe to say that that's uncommon for us to think of, to conceptualize morals in that way today. But I think that's one of the reasons why it can be so illuminating to read Kant, just because he offers and argues very clearly, somewhat clearly, for a theory that is again so contrary to the way we usually think. But so just for that reason, it can reveal new aspects of this question for us. And so again, for Kant, he believes that it's possible to ground ethics in reason itself. And for Kant, reason means something not as though it's reason as though it's something in my head. It's rather reason as something that we conform with in our thinking. And so we don't imagine that reason or mathematics, for example. We don't suppose that just because I have to think to do arithmetic or perform calculations in my head, I don't suppose that that those calculations are in some ways unique to me or subjective to me. It's rather I'm bringing my mind into some kind of conformity with those objective laws of reason. And this is the way that Kant thinks about ethics. There's the quintessential example for Kant to try to show how, because this might seem kind of improbable that you could make the leap from mathematics or from reason, from logic, to moral action. But I'll try to show how Kant does that, and the quintessential example is the question of telling a lie. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, it's very straightforward in the sense that, whether you tell a lie or not is immaterial. The only thing that matters is what is the outcome of that. So if by telling a lie you can somehow increase net pleasure or net happiness, then by all means, and in fact you're somewhat obligated to tell the lie in order to increase some kind of net happiness. For Kant, it's just the opposite. For Kant, the notion of telling a lie itself is wrong. Yeah. And so again, from the utilitarian perspective, lying by itself is neither right or wrong. The only thing that's right or wrong is the projected consequences that follow from telling that lie. For Kant, the idea is that by lying itself is committing some kind of moral fallacy, some kind of sin against the order of reason. And he explains that by saying, look, the basis to tell a lie, the basis for a lie is truth. And so, in other words, we couldn't tell a lie. It wouldn't be possible to tell a lie. It wouldn't be possible, except that most of the time we tell the truth, right? And so, a lie is kind of it's parasitic on truth, on true speech. A false speech depends on true speech. You can think about it like this: if we always assumed that what we said was untrue, in other words, if we always assumed we were lying, we couldn't really lie in the first place because we would have taken away our basis for lying, right? We would have no standard, so it wouldn't be a lie. It would just be noise, basically. And so Kant's idea is that, in some ways, and this comes to another kind of important and essential aspect of Kant's ethics, which is the notion of, he calls it a categorical imperative. And categorical just means universal, like not hypothetical. So he contrasts categorical to hypothetical imperative. And so a categorical imperative is one that is not, it's not like, oh, if this is the case, then I'll do this. No. It's categorical. It applies across all categories in all circumstances. And so for Kant, ethics is based on these categorical imperatives. And he gives three different formulations of the categorical imperative, but in his mind, they're kind of saying the same thing in different ways. And the first one that he gives is pertinent to this question of telling a lie. And he says that anything I do, I should, for it to be moral, the maxim or the concept behind it has to be something that whatever is the will behind my actions, or whatever I'm doing, at the same time as I'm performing something, I can also will that everybody should perform the same thing. In other words, the kind of inverse of that is to say, well, I'm going to make some kind of exception for myself, and I'm going to do something that I'm happy that not everyone does this, right? And we see that in some way, we might have an initial moral aversion to that, because in some way it does seem, somewhat irresponsible in some way to always be holding double standards, right, and making exceptions for yourself. It's clear we have that intuitive feeling. What's interesting is, for Kant, that's not at all the basis for why he thinks it's wrong to make an exception of yourself. He's rather appealing to the fact that it flouts the principle of non-contradiction. In other words, imagine yourself kind of objectively amongst all human beings. Now, you can't have one standard for what this one single human being that you call you, and then another standard for the other ones. It's rather, for Kant, the idea is, no, reason is something objective that we participate in. That would kind of flout the law of non-contradiction. Yeah. Because you'd have one maxim operative for one member of this class, and then a different maxim operative for all the other members that you would be willing. And so for Kant, rather than the kind of instinctual aversion that we feel towards always making exceptions for ourselves, for Kant it's rather, what makes it wrong is that it's illogical, it's unreasonable in a sense. So it's quite a strange and somewhat exciting way to think about ethics, just because it is so extraordinary, so unusual. Again, Kant, in a similar way to John Stuart Mill, has a sort of idealistic or utopian vision that if only we can formulate the perfect theory of ethics, and by perfect it's like something that is universally applicable, that you could just formulate the perfect theory of ethics and then apply it across the board. This is their sort of utopian vision, and then they imagine that everyone could agree on things that people have been fighting about for millennia. And so this is Kant's attempt. There are several other ways in which he formulates the categorical imperative, and again, what that simply means is the kind of the universal basis for moral action. It would be contrasted to a sort of provisional or hypothetical imperative that would say, like, well, in this case do this, in this case do something else. For Kant, he's adamant that those exceptions, well, they in some way they don't make sense. They don't follow from the tenets that Kant has tried to base his theory of ethics on. Again, because reason is something that is universal, that we all participate in. Kant is, very easily criticized for almost caricatured. It's not difficult to do, just like it's not difficult to caricature utilitarianism and provide something like the trolley problem, which we briefly talked about in our discussion. And for Kant, there's a kind of Kant's trolley problem, so to speak, is suppose that in order to save someone's life, you had to tell a lie. Like, suppose there was a hatchet murderer coming, and they're asking whether your brother is inside the house, and you have to sit, and most of us would think, well, you just say no, and then maybe you'll be lucky enough that he will go next door. For Kant, he's kind of committed to say that no matter what, you would still be doing something immoral by telling a lie itself. And again, because for Kant, it's like if you're going to evaluate the morality of something, the place to do that is not in its consequences. The place to do that is in the act itself. Yeah. And so whether this, and that's an interesting question because there's always, the question is whether Kantian ethics can be flexible enough to accommodate an objection like that. Because if an objection like that, I think most people will have a very difficult time accepting the notion that you could never tell a lie even to save someone's life. And Kant doesn't really address that objection. But I think it's still possible to address that objection, and I think it would just demand being a little bit more flexible with what we're talking about in terms of our the maxims that we're universalizing. And so rather than saying something like so a maxim that we couldn't universalize, in other words, a maxim that we couldn't say, and maxim, again, it's like kind of conceptual formulation of the motive behind the action. We could never say, never will that everyone should lie. And on that basis, Kant says that therefore no one should lie, even you. and so on that basis, telling a lie would be wrong, categorically, in all cases. One way we might make Kantian ethics a little bit more accommodating and more feasible in some sense, because again, I think it would be hard for most people to accept the idea that it would be immoral to tell a lie, even to save someone's life. I think we can just be a little bit more, more accommodating with the way we think about the maxims. And we could say something like, I will never tell a lie unless it's in the service of saving someone's life, right? And so we can see how this doesn't depart from the basic deontological precepts, which has to do with evaluating morality according to the motive behind our actions, rather than the consequences of those actions. So I think even if we become more pliant with our maxims of action, I think we can still maintain some kind of fidelity to Kantian ethics, and but also avoid those kind of situations that were in some ways completely contradicting our intuitive, basically what our conscience would tell us to do. This is probably a good place to stop. I think that I've at least begun to give something of a picture of Kantian ethics, and especially how it compares and contrasts with utilitarian ethics. Again, I think these two systems, it's quite helpful to have them in a juxtaposition, one against the other, because each one serves to kind of illuminate the other precisely through its differences. And so I hope that what I've said today has been helpful in that respect. And with that, I will end this video and wish everyone the best until next time.